The chill that December delivered to New Orleans wasn't the kind that kissed your cheeks, it was the kind that clawed at your bones. Maggie Bennett, small for her 22 years, pulled her threadbare denim jacket tighter, its cheap fabric offering less resistance than a paper napkin. She was 5 blocks into the long walk home from her double shift at the Bayou Diner on Canal Street. The meager tips, mostly damp singles, balled up in her pocket, a pathetic offering toward next month's Tulane tuition. Maggie didn't have the luxury of quitting. She had the burden of never giving up. Every late-night shift, every soaked walk, was a desperate losing battle against a life that had been trying to drown her since the Mississippi River flood stole her parents. The air hung thick and humid, a pre-storm sweat, smelling of chicory coffee, old grease, and impending rain. When her old, cracked phone vibrated with an unknown number, Maggie almost ignored it. Another bill collector. But as she stepped under the sickly yellow light of a flickering street lamp, something, perhaps the sheer exhaustion blurring her judgment, made her sum the screen. "Hello?" she answered, her voice rough from 8 hours of shouting orders over sizzling grills. Silence. Not dead air, but a thick, shallow silence punctuated by the unmistakable, terrifying sound of teeth chattering. "Is someone there?" Maggie pressed, instantly clutching the phone to her ear. The air around her dropped 10 degrees, though it had nothing to do with the weather. Then, barely audible above the distant rumble of a streetcar, came a small, broken sound, the whimper of a child in absolute distress. The background noise was relentless, the whoosh of passing tires and the growing drumming of rain against concrete, making it agonizingly clear the caller was outside, unprotected, somewhere on this unforgiving urban landscape. A small, terrified voice finally materialized, thin as glass. "Help!" It was followed by a gasp and then nothing but silent, wrenching sobs. Maggie's exhaustion vanished, replaced by an acute, visceral dread. That sound, it tore at the protective, maternal instinct she rarely allowed herself to feel. "Where are you, honey?" Maggie asked, already turning, her own desperate circumstances forgotten. "Can you tell me what you see? Anything at all?" The child managed only a stammer, the words barely coherent through violent shivering. She was at Lafayette Square, near a large white building, sitting on a bench. Maggie knew the spot, a place of grandeur and politics, completely deserted at this hour. She broke into a run, worn sneakers slapping against the wet asphalt. She was heading into the heart of the city's historic district, chasing a terrified whisper in the rain, unknowingly sprinting straight into a world where life and death were managed by a completely different set of rules. Maggie's breath burned in her lungs as she finally reached Lafayette Square. The historic park, usually a bright public space, was now a pitch-black expanse swallowed by the downpour. She spotted her target huddled beneath the vast, wet canopy of an old magnolia tree. The girl was soaked to the bone in a uniform that had clearly cost a fortune, expensive wool plastered to a fragile, small frame. Long, dark hair hung in sodden ropes around a face too pale and eyes too haunted for a child so young. This wasn't a runaway. This was a wounded, lost soul. "I'm Maggie," she said softly, approaching slowly, hands visible. She moved the way you'd approach a frightened animal, gentle and non-threatening. "I got your call. I'm here to help you, okay?" The girl, Penny, could only nod, her lips tinged blue, shivering so violently her entire body spasmed. She was clutching a small, cracked pink phone like a lifeline. Maggie carefully draped her own inadequate, threadbare jacket around the girl's trembling shoulders. "Can you tell me your name again, honey? Is there someone I can call for you?" Maggie asked, gently rubbing Penny's arms to restore circulation. Penny's deep brown eyes, filled with a mixture of relief and consuming fear, met Maggie's for only a second before flicking down to the pink phone. Her tiny fingers fumbled with the screen before she held it out. A contact, highlighted. Dad. Maggie hesitated for only a second before hitting dial, expecting a frantic, normal parent, maybe a messy, privileged divorce situation. What answered was not a voice of worry, but a sound like polished stone dropping onto concrete. It was deep, commanding, and absolutely chilling. "Who's dead?" The 3 words cut through the pouring rain, carrying a brutal, detached authority. Maggie's breath hitched. This was not a panicked father. No one's dead, Maggie responded quickly, her free arm instinctively pulling Penny tighter against her side. But I think I found your daughter in Lafayette Square. She's cold, wet, and can barely speak. Her lips are blue. The silence that followed was heavy, a vacuum of all sound but the rain, stretching out for 3 eternal seconds. Then the man spoke again, his tone shifting from hostile threat to something equally intense, but focused, edged with pure steel. Put her on. The sound of movement and what sounded like barked orders in the background suggested instant mobilization. She's not really able to talk right now, Maggie explained, noting how Penny curled tighter into her side, burrowing away from the sound of the phone. She needs dry clothes and likely medical attention. A string of muffled, controlled curses followed before the voice returned, now utterly cold. Don't move from that spot, miss. I'll be there in 8 minutes. It wasn't an offer. It was a non-negotiable command. True to his word, exactly 8 minutes later, 3 black Cadillac Escalades with impossibly dark-tinted windows screeched to a halt along the park perimeter. The center vehicle disgorged a tall man in an expensive, tailored suit. He moved with a devastating, predatory grace, despite the downpour, flanked by 2 other men who scanned the area with the practiced, efficient awareness of elite security personnel. This was August Carter. The moment Penny spotted him, she tried to stand but swayed dangerously, prompting Maggie to steady her. The terrifying, synchronized arrival was the final, indelible sign Maggie had just left the world of bad tips and student debt and entered the epicenter of organized American power. August Carter dropped to one knee before his daughter, Penny. The single word, Penny, carrying a note of profound relief that was the only unguarded emotion Maggie would ever see him display. He wrapped her in his custom-tailored suit jacket, a layer of protection more valuable than Maggie's entire wardrobe, and lifted her into his arms. The tenderness of the gesture was violently at odds with the cold, lethal calculation in his eyes when they finally settled on Maggie. You called instead of the police, he stated, his voice a low, assessing rumble that carried no gratitude, only analysis. His gaze moved slowly, taking in her sodden waitress uniform, her worn sneakers, and the exhaustion etched beneath her eyes. Why? Maggie stood awkwardly, gathering her own soaked jacket. I should go. I have an early class tomorrow. I should go. I have an early class tomorrow. She took a step back, suddenly hyper-aware of the security men forming a silent, protective perimeter. A flicker of something, perhaps a filing of data, crossed Carter's face. Are you a student? He asked, the information clearly being logged away. Nursing at Tulane, Maggie replied, determined to maintain her footing. Is Penny going to be okay? Thanks to you, he said after a moment, the first acknowledgement of her service. My driver will take you home. Samuel will get your information. I'd like to properly thank you for helping my daughter. It was not an offer. It was a non-negotiable command delivered with absolute authority. The next morning, Maggie was escorted to the Garden District mansion, a journey from her crumbling apartment complex to a world of absolute power. August was waiting in his study. I want to hire you, he interrupted, cutting off her protest before it began. You're studying nursing. You need the time to focus. That's what I'm prepared to offer as a monthly salary if you move into the East Wing and focus exclusively on helping Penny readjust. He unfolded the paper, and the figure written there was enough to pay off her entire tuition debt and fund the rest of her degree without a single loan. It was a staggering amount of money, a sum that represented instant freedom from years of grinding poverty. This is excessive, she managed, looking up at his clinical gaze. My daughter's well-being isn't a matter where I concern myself with appropriate budget constraints, Miss Bennett, he replied, the steel back in his voice. She looked at the figure, then at the photo of Penny on his desk. Maggie accepted, not out of greed, but because this payment was the only way out of her exhausting, never-ending struggle. It was a dangerous price for freedom. The commute from Maggie's crumbling apartment to the Carter residence in the Garden District was a journey between worlds. The mansion, with its Greek Revival columns and sprawling verandas, spoke of generations of old, formidable wealth. But the wealth felt less like comfort and more like a fortress. Behind the ornate wrought iron gates, the atmosphere was oppressive, the stately grandeur suffocating. Maggie found herself living in the East Wing, a world unto itself with its own courtyard garden, kitchen, and sitting room, luxurious, immaculate, and utterly isolated from the main house where August Carter conducted his shadowy business. Maggie's isolation was complete, enforced by professional distance and invisible walls. She traded the late-night clamor of the diner for an unsettling silence, broken only by the discreet, almost imperceptible shifts of the security detail. Her immediate superior, Samuel, the chief of security, was the human embodiment of the mansion's atmosphere. He was unfailingly polite, his movements silent, his neutral expression suggesting professional discretion was a job requirement. Yet his watchful brown eyes missed nothing. When he spoke, it was often to deliver precise, unsolicited warnings wrapped in information, such as casually mentioning that Mr. Carter owned several import businesses and was a very influential man in New Orleans. Maggie recognized the careful phrasing for what it was, a chilling reminder that she was under surveillance, that her new employer wasn't just wealthy, he was dangerous. She found herself subconsciously adopting the mansion's silent rules. Don't wander, don't ask questions, and never touch the technology in the main study. In this gilded cage, Maggie was acutely aware that she was not a guest or an employee. She was a prized, fragile possession, a caretaker whose value lay solely in her ability to reach the one person August Carter couldn't. The true mystery wasn't what he did, but how she was ever supposed to leave this beautiful, terrifying world intact. 3 weeks into her new life, the oppressive silence of the mansion was proving more unnerving than the chaos of the Bayou Diner. The East Wing offered a comforting buffer zone, but it was just a temporary perimeter. This morning, as Maggie rounded a corner with Penny's breakfast tray, the buffer was violently breached. 2 men she didn't recognize, suit-clad but with the cold, hard eyes of professional enforcers, were exiting August's study. Their hushed, intense conversation cut off instantly when they saw her. The taller man's hand twitched subtly toward his jacket before August appeared in the doorway behind them. "Miss Bennet," August said smoothly, his eyes communicating a clear, silent message: retreat. The shorter man, with a thick, barely concealed New York accent, let his gaze sweep over Maggie with blatant disdain. "This the nanny you mentioned, Carter? Caretaker?" August corrected him, placing himself subtly between Maggie and the visitors. "Miss Bennet is helping my daughter through a difficult time." The men nodded, their expressions non-committal, but their calculating eyes remained fixed on Maggie. "Family is everything in our business, isn't it, Carter?" Later that night, as Maggie restlessly wandered her corridor, she heard the unmistakable sound of August's clipped, low voice drifting up from the partially open study window below. She tried to keep walking, but her feet carried her to the balcony. August's words were sharp, carrying the steel edge she'd heard that first night on the phone. "The Mendoza territory isn't up for negotiation. They've respected our boundaries for 3 generations. I'm not interested in being the first Carter to break that peace." A different voice, fueled by barely controlled anger, responded, "The port expansion changes everything, August. If you're too sentimental to see that, maybe your father stepped down too soon." The silence that followed was terrifying. When August finally spoke, his voice had dropped to a quiet, lethal register. "Question my leadership again, and sentiment will be the least of your concerns. Now get out of my house before you wake my daughter." Maggie retreated instantly, her stomach tight with understanding. Her safe room wasn't a secure placement. It was just a liability strategically placed within a war zone. August's concern wasn't affection. It was intensely territorial. 3 weeks of patient, quiet determination had yielded only sparse, small results. Maggie had logged exactly 17 spoken words from Penny, all transactional, like book or no, since her arrival. The child remained a closed, frightened box. Frustrated by the pervasive tension of the mansion, Maggie decided to abandon the rigid schedules and instead led Penny to the estate's sunlit solarium. It was a tropical bubble of warmth and lush greenery, a world away from the cold reality of August's business. "My mom used to say that plants are the best listeners," Maggie confided, settling onto a blanket beside a large peace lily, 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate ready.
The humid, silent space created a comforting cocoon. Maggie spoke, not to Penny, but to the plant, her voice gentle and confiding. "I'm worried about someone I care about. She's carrying something heavy inside, something she can't put into words yet." Maggie continued, carefully avoiding eye contact. "I wish I knew how to help her feel safe enough to set it down, because sometimes the heaviest things get lighter when we share them."
Penny, curled beside her, went absolutely still. Maggie waited, letting the silence stretch, broken only by the drip of humidity and the distant sound of security patrols. She had nearly given up when Penny's small voice emerged, barely audible even in the quiet room, her eyes fixed on the melting marshmallows in her mug. "I saw them arguing." Maggie froze, maintaining her casual posture, offering only a slow, gentle nod to encourage continuation without pressure. Penny's first complete sentence in months, her first voluntary reference to her mother. "Mom and Dad, the day before," Penny whispered, her voice gaining the slightest trembling strength. "She said she was taking me away, that Dad's business was too dangerous." Penny looked up, her deep brown eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I pretended to be asleep so they wouldn't stop fighting because of me." The confession hung in the air, heavy with a child's misplaced guilt and a devastating implication. This was not a simple car accident. This was a tragedy rooted in August Carter's world, introducing a darker, more complex mystery behind her mother's death. Penny's whispered confession, the fighting, and the mother's plan to take her away left Maggie reeling. It ripped through the comfortable lie that August Carter's life was merely controversial. It demanded action. Maggie knew with grim certainty that the accident Penny's mother had suffered was a convenient narrative designed to protect the child. A nursing student might not know organized crime, but she knew trauma and she knew manipulation. August had been evasive, but he'd also been careless in his confidence. That night, after Penny finally slept, Maggie abandoned all pretense of boundaries. Driven by a desperate need to know what kind of war she was now enlisted in, she used the master key Samuel had given her for the East Wing access and quietly entered August's main study. The room was a monument to control, polished mahogany, leather, and walls lined with books that smelled of power. Her eyes were drawn not to the antique maps, but to a discreet, locked file cabinet tucked into the wall behind a towering shelf of legal texts. Using the skills honed by years of navigating red tape in the foster system, Maggie bypassed the simple lock using a hairpin and a minute's worth of focused attention. Inside, she found a series of heavily redacted police reports from the Louisiana State Police and several thick, labeled folders. One was titled simply Lafayette. As she scanned the documents, the truth hit her like a physical blow, cold and undeniable. The single vehicle crash Penny's mother died in was meticulously planned. The police report mentioned a suspicious failure of the brake lines and unconfirmed reports of a second vehicle fleeing the scene near Baton Rouge, but it was the Carter internal memo that provided the chilling clarity. The hit was a warning shot, a tactical message from the Mendoza cartel, a major rival family operating out of Houston, Texas, and aggressively challenging August's Gulf Coast influence. The accident occurred after our divorce was finalized. Penny was supposed to be with her that weekend. August's cold explanation now took on a sinister context. The Mendozas, unable to hurt August directly, had targeted the most visible and accessible weakness, his former wife, a clear message meant to terrorize him and destabilize his organization. Maggie's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the realization of how deeply she was implicated. She was now the new civilian vulnerability. She was sleeping in a mansion actively under siege. August hadn't hired her for her kindness. He'd hired her because she had already shown she would protect Penny, and she was already a known variable. She wasn't just a caretaker, she was a target in the crosshairs of a major crime organization. Quietly, she locked the cabinet, the knowledge she now possessed heavier and more lethal than any weapon in the mansion. The fragile temporary peace of the East Wing was shattered 2 hours after Maggie's terrifying discovery. She was helping Kenny mix vibrant watercolors for a landscape painting when a muted, powerful thump vibrated through the mansion's marble floors. Moments later, Samuel appeared in the doorway, his usual composure visibly strained despite his professional mask. He carried a tablet displaying what appeared to be urgent security footage. August's face, when he looked at the screen, transformed instantly. All traces of the attentive father vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, focused determination, the face of the mafia boss at war. He stood abruptly, the only instruction he gave delivered with terrifying finality. "Penny, stay with Maggie. No garden visits." He strode from the veranda without another word. Within minutes, the familiar black convoy had roared away from the Garden District mansion. That evening, the news reports confirmed Maggie's fear. A massive warehouse explosion in the lower 9th Ward. 3 casualties. Authorities vaguely referred to possible criminal connections, but refused to name specific organizations. August referred to it only as the warehouse incident. The aftermath lingered in the mansion like a storm cloud, manifest in increased security and hushed conversations that fell silent whenever Maggie approached. Penny, always sensitive to atmosphere, retreated further into herself. Just past midnight, Samuel returned, his demeanor firm yet carefully polite. "Miss Bennett, please take Miss Carter to the safe room immediately," he instructed, his tone brooking no argument. "Mr. Carter's orders. There's been a threat against the family." Penny's paintbrush clattered to the table, her eyes wide with a fear that suggested this wasn't an anomaly, but a practiced routine. Without question, she gathered her favorite stuffed otter and gripped Maggie's hand with shocking strength. Samuel added the chilling context as he verified the security system. The Rivera situation escalated, rival family making a statement after the warehouse incident. They're testing boundaries now that Penny is back in Mr. Carter's life. Maggie and Penny were rushed through a concealed panel in August's study, confined in a comfortable yet terrifying bunker to wait out the war August was waging outside their thick steel door. The safe room, though luxurious, was a claustrophobic cage of anxiety. 8 hours stretched Maggie's patience thin as she watched the silent security monitors showing a tense, deserted compound. Penny, however, had retreated entirely. The progress of recent weeks seemed erased, her body language reverting to the closed-off posture of their first meeting, her small hands clutching her stuffed otter like a shield. "Your dad will be back soon," Maggie assured her softly, trying to sound confident. "He promised he'd be home for dinner, remember?" Penny's only response was to clutch the otter tighter, her eyes fixed on the black screen showing the mansion's main entrance. The tension spoke volumes about previous promises broken and fears realized. Frustrated by the regression, Maggie abandoned the board games. She took Penny to the small, sterile kitchenette and poured 2 mugs of cocoa. "I'm tired of being quiet," Maggie confided, talking softly to the cocoa, just as she had to the peace lily. "Being quiet is heavy. It makes you feel like the bad things are your fault." Penny went rigid. Maggie knew she had hit the nerve. She didn't press, merely continued cleaning the counter, giving Penny the space to speak. Minutes passed in suffocating silence until Penny's voice, small and tight with shame, finally broke. "I got sick because I heard them arguing. I heard them arguing about his business, and I wanted them to stop, so I got sick so they'd focus on me." Tears welled, but she fought them back. "The next day, she left without me to go to Baton Rouge, and then she was gone forever." The child's logic was heartbreakingly simple and devastating. "If I hadn't gotten sick, she would be here. It's my fault they got her." Maggie finally turned, her own eyes burning, and pulled Penny into a fierce, wordless hug. "Penny, whatever happened, whatever your dad does, none of it is your fault," Maggie whispered fiercely into her child's hair. "You didn't cause the fighting, and you didn't cause the car accident. You were just a little girl who missed her mom." The dam finally broke. Penny's silent anxiety dissolved into body-racking sobs, weeks of contained grief pouring out onto Maggie's shoulder. Neither of them noticed the safe room door glide open a crack, nor did they see August Carter, his usual impeccable appearance marred by exhaustion and dried blood on his collar, standing frozen in the doorway. He listened to the entire confession, his expression cycling through shock, profound grief, and a terrifying vulnerability. He silently withdrew, closing the door. He finally saw the depth of his daughter's pain and the unique, irreplaceable power Maggie held to heal her. The fragile, temporary calm that followed Penny's breakthrough was violently short-lived. Just 2 hours after August had silently withdrawn from the safe room door, Maggie was helping Penny prepare her breakfast when the mansion's state-of-the-art security system activated. It wasn't a blare, but a series of discreet, unmistakable clicks as heavy exterior doors automatically locked and shutters descended over vulnerable windows. Penny's small body immediately stiffened, her eyes wide with a deep-seated fear that suggested this system's activation was a sign of true, imminent danger, not a drill. Before Maggie could form a question, Samuel burst through the kitchen doorway, his usual composure visibly absent. He was pale and his voice was tight with urgency. "Miss Bennet, we need to move you and Miss Carter to the panic room now," he instructed, his tone snapping through the morning air. "Mr. Carter's orders. The south perimeter has been breached." Without question, Penny snatched her stuffed otter and gripped Maggie's hand, her movement fluid and practiced. They didn't have time to process the fear. Samuel and 2 armed guards, their weapons now drawn and moving with a terrifying efficiency, escorted them through the service corridors. The atmosphere was of silent, coiled dread until the moment they rounded the corner toward the main hall. Gunfire erupted from somewhere near the front entrance, a series of rapid, echoing cracks that ripped the silence to shreds. The sound was deafening, the kind of raw, brutal violence that Maggie had only seen in movies. The lead guard immediately went down with a sharp cry, clutching his shoulder. "Run!" the second guard commanded, shoving Maggie and Penny forward with brute force. "The study is 20 meters ahead. Get inside and lock the door." Maggie grabbed Penny's hand and sprinted, her heart hammering against her ribs. The child, surprisingly swift, kept pace, propelled by pure terror. Behind them, more gunshots echoed, followed by the heavy, sickening thud of a body hitting the marble floor. They reached the ornate, heavy study door just as heavy, rapid footsteps rounded the far corner of the corridor. They were too late. 2 men in tactical gear, their faces masked and firearms raised, burst into view. The first shot splintered the doorframe beside Maggie's head, sending wood fragments flying. "Where is the child?" demanded one of the intruders, his accent thick with a Caribbean inflection that instantly brought the Mendoza cartel to Maggie's mind. "Carter's daughter. We know she's with you." Maggie shoved Penny behind a heavy oak bookcase, seconds before the assassins advanced into the room. The chaos had arrived. The terrifying sound of the splintering doorframe beside her head galvanized Maggie. Her mind raced through options, finding none. The 2 men in tactical gear advanced, their firearms steady. "Where is the child?" the leader, thick with a Caribbean accent, demanded. "Carter's daughter. We know she's with you." "She's not here," Maggie lied, praying that Penny would remain silent behind the heavy bookcase. "August took her away last night." The taller intruder laughed, the sound utterly devoid of humor. "You expect us to believe Carter would leave his precious daughter with the mansion under attack?" He gestured with his weapon. "Search the room, Mateo. The boss wants the girl unharmed, but he didn't specify about the nanny." As Mateo moved to flank her, a sudden noise, a heavy metallic crash from the hallway, plunged the room into shadow as the intruder accidentally shattered a large vase. Maggie used the momentary distraction, lunging with desperate, calculated force. She slammed her full weight into the taller mercenary's midsection, sending them both crashing into a side table. "Run, Penny!" she screamed, the adrenaline burning in her throat. "The safe room, now!" She clawed at the man's face, fighting with a primal ferocity she never knew she possessed, desperate to buy the child seconds. From her peripheral vision, Maggie saw Penny dart from behind the bookcase, a tiny silhouette moving toward the hidden panel that concealed the safe room entrance. The second intruder, Mateo, shouted in triumph, pivoting instantly to pursue her. Just as he raised his weapon, the study door burst open again, blown inward by an unseen force. August Carter stood framed in the wreckage. He was a vision of controlled, incandescent fury, a pistol gripped with deadly calm in each hand. 2 rapid, deafening shots cracked through the room, stopping the intruder pursuing Penny before he could take another step. The scent of gunpowder instantly mingled with the humid air. "Daddy!" Penny cried, changing direction instantly to run toward her father. Maggie was still struggling on the floor. The first attacker, recovering from her initial strike, had managed to pin her down, his large, powerful hands closing like vices around her throat. Black spots danced and swam in Maggie's vision as oxygen dwindled, her lungs burning for air that couldn't pass through her constricted windpipe. Through her dimming consciousness, she registered August's voice, commanding Penny, "Princess, cover your eyes." It was followed by a sharp, loud sound that instantly released the pressure on her throat. "Maggie, breathe, just breathe. You're safe now." August's voice penetrated the ringing in her ears as gentle, strong hands lifted her to a sitting position. Air rushed painfully into her lungs as she coughed and gasped, tasting blood and dust. August's arm supported her back while his free hand kept Penny pressed against his side, the child's face carefully turned away from the carnage in the room. The dying mercenary, gazing blankly at the ornate ceiling, used his last breath to deliver a chilling final taunt. His eyes fixed on August, his voice a ragged whisper thick with Caribbean spite. "You shouldn't have gone after the Donovans, Carter. The girl's family knows everything." August froze, his fury replaced by a profound, cold shock. He absorbed the taunt, his eyes locking onto Maggie's. He had protected his daughter, and he had protected her caretaker, but the cryptic final words hung in the air. The Donovans. The mercenary was dead, but the seeds of the final mystery had been violently planted. Hours later, after the chaos had been surgically removed, the bodies vanished, the blood washed from the marble steps, and Penny finally asleep under sedation, August found Maggie in the solarium. She wasn't looking at the plants. She was staring blankly through the glass ceiling at the star-filled sky, processing the surreal brutality of the day. August settled into a chair beside her, his custom suit still marred by a faint dark stain on the collar, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and a rare, profound vulnerability. "You saved her life today," he stated quietly, pouring himself a measure of bourbon from a crystal decanter he'd brought with him. He didn't offer one to Maggie, seemingly aware she needed clarity, not distraction. "You came for her because of you," Maggie responded, her voice raspy from the attack. No accusation in her tone, merely voicing the undeniable, terrifying fact. "Because of what you do." August was silent for a long moment, watching the amber liquid swirl in the glass. When he finally answered, his voice was weighted with a rare, naked honesty. "Yes," he admitted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "The Mendoza family thought taking Penny would force me to surrender territory in the port expansion. The Rivera situation, it was a message." "You're not just an importer, August," Maggie stated, using his first name instinctively for the first time in a context of pure confrontation. "You control organized crime in half of New Orleans." "I maintain order in a system that would exist with or without me. The Carters have overseen these territories for 3 generations. We prevent the chaos that comes from power vacuums and turf wars." He rose, pushing a manila folder across the nearby table toward her. It wasn't the checkbook or a contract. It was a plain, unmarked file, her name written across the top in official, familiar lettering. "Before you make any decisions about leaving, there's something you should know about your parents." Maggie's breath hitched. She recognized the official lettering from years of foster care documentation. Her fingers trembled as she pulled open the file. Inside were police reports, weather data, and an internal memo from a private investigation firm. "What is this?" she whispered, unable to look away from the cold print. "The truth about the flood that killed them," August answered quietly. "They didn't perish by accident, Maggie. They were targeted because your father, a small business owner, refused to launder money for the Donovan crime family in Baton Rouge." The revelation hit Maggie like a physical blow. The mystery of the late warning, the failing neighborhood pumps, the bodies found downstream rather than in their home. Her entire past was rewritten in a flash of sinister new light. "How long have you known this?" she managed, her throat tight with a pain unrelated to the attack. "Since I had you investigated, after you helped Penny," August admitted, his eyes holding hers. "The Donovans were eliminated 5 years ago in a turf war with the Carters. My father made sure it was." A stunned, bitter laugh escaped Maggie's lips. "So, in a way," she said slowly, processing the devastating implications, "your family avenged mine without ever knowing it." "Sometimes justice finds its path through unexpected channels. I can't change what I am, Maggie, but I can promise that you and Penny will always be protected, whatever you decide." Their destiny was irrevocably bound, one family providing the reason for the trauma, the other providing the brutal final resolution. Dawn broke over the Garden District with a violent summer storm, rain lashing against the windows and sheets that seemed intent on washing away the violence of the previous day. Maggie stood on the covered veranda, watching the deluge create ripples in the puddles, a quiet, internal turbulence mirroring the external chaos. Her throat still ached, and her mind replayed the twin images of August's lethal fury and his profound vulnerability. The impossible decision, weighted by the Donovan revelation, hung before her. August Carter appeared beside her with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, his usual impeccable tailoring restored, yet his eyes remained shadowed. "Your scholarship paperwork is ready to submit," he said, his tone businesslike. "Tulane's advanced nursing program would welcome you for the fall semester." The safety net was still there, but it felt irrelevant. Maggie accepted the coffee without comment. "And Penny?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "She's asking for you," August replied, the simple statement carrying more weight than 1,000 promises. "She wants to know if you're leaving because of what happened." A bitter, painful laugh escaped Maggie's lips. "What happened is that I witnessed multiple murders in a home invasion orchestrated by your business rivals," she said, voicing the surreal truth aloud. "And yet you're still here," August observed, his gaze carefully neutral as he studied her profile. "Most people would have run at the first opportunity." Maggie turned to face him fully, seeing beyond the calculated control to the genuine uncertainty beneath, a powerful man suddenly stripped bare by the simple demand of human emotion. "I stay because Penny needs stability, not because I condone what you do." August nodded slowly, a small but profound display of acceptance. "I've made arrangements to move Penny to our property in the Cayman Islands until the situation with the Mendoza family is permanently resolved." "You're leaving New Orleans?" Maggie asked, unexpected disappointment coloring her tone despite her better judgment. "When we're leaving," August corrected, the emphasis subtle but unmistakable. The invitation hung between them, heavy with implications that neither was prepared to voice aloud. It was a proposal for a shared life built on danger and destiny. "And if I don't?" Maggie asked, needing to understand the exact shape of her choice. "Then the scholarship stands, along with the security detail, until the Mendoza situation is permanently resolved. Your safety isn't conditional on your decision to stay with us." Maggie found the girl in her bedroom, methodically packing favorite books. When Penny spotted Maggie, she abandoned her task and ran across the room, wrapping her thin arms around Maggie's waist. "You're not leaving, right? We could be your family. Dad smiles when you're around. He never used to smile after Mom left." 2 hours later, Maggie stood with August in his study. "I've made my decision," she stated, hands steady at her sides. Relief, immediate and intense, flickered across August's face before his composition reasserted itself. "Just for Penny?" he asked, the question revealing his deepest hope. "I'll come with you to the Cayman Islands for Penny's sake," Maggie answered honestly. Her eyes met his, confirming the choice but asserting her boundaries. "For now, the rest we'll have to see with time." As the private jet carried them over the Gulf of Mexico that night, Penny slept peacefully in Maggie's lap, while August worked quietly opposite them. Lightning illuminated the clouds outside, revealing new landscapes in what had seemed only darkness moments before. Maggie had chosen to trade her old struggle for a new, infinitely more dangerous one, irrevocably tied to the mafia boss whose world held the keys to both her destruction and her past. Thank you all for following this intense story. If the suspense, the action, and the chemistry between Maggie and August captivated you, please let me know. Like this video to send a signal to the algorithm.
Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what you think will happen in the Cayman Islands. And most importantly, subscribe and share this story so we can bring you the next thrilling chapter. Your support is what makes these stories possible.